Now before we get started, I do want to make something really clear. I love Spider-Man. And as a Spider-Man fan, I've grabbed any Spidey comic book I could get my hands on, I've attained any piece of Spidey merch I could possibly find, I've seen every single Spider-Man cartoon, I've played every single Spider-Man game, and have watched every single Spider-Man movie. And just like all of you Spidey fans out there, we have each embraced Spidey in our own unique way, and he all means something different to each and every one of us. And while we all have our own preferences towards which Spidey we appeal to the most, there is still a lot of opinions regarding certain iterations of Spider-Man regardless of any media in which he's featured in. And given all the major events that occurred relating to Spider-Man within 2018, such as his huge major role within one of the most popular and successful Marvel movies ever made, as well as his major success within Spider-Man PS4 and the Golden Globe award-winning film Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And as an honorable mention, one of Spider-Man's most popular villains of Venom actually starred in his own unique movie that took place within 2018 as well. So seeing how great of a year 2018 was for Spider-Man, dubbed the Year of the Spider, 2019 is going to mark something extremely special for the wall crawler, given that this is his second standalone film within the MCU. Not only that, but it's also been confirmed that Spider-Man Far From Home is indeed going to be the first installment within the Marvel Cinematic Universe's fourth phase. And to add even more pressure to this movie, it's also confirmed to set literally minutes after the events of Avengers Endgame. So not only is there a lot riding on Far From Home, given all the high expectations fans have for it due to the huge success of Spider-Man within 2018 in all forms of media, but also given what the events of Avengers Endgame are going to lead, with having Far From Home be the other stepping stone of the Marvel Cinematic Universe going forward. And in my personal opinion, I do think that Sony and Marvel have done an alright job with implementing Spider-Man within their version of the character within the MCU. However, given some of the criticisms that certain fans have towards Spider-Man Homecoming, as well as what we're seeing currently within Far From Home, I do feel the need to express my criticisms towards the movie going forward. And mainly involving all the MCU films that feature Spider-Man, I have seen Civil War up to 4 times, Homecoming a total of 3 times, and Infinity War twice. And each time I've seen each film, I do like it more every time. Which is why I'm going to be discussing the main criticisms that I do have with the Far From Home trailer, and how I believe that Marvel and Sony can make Far From Home a really great film. And to reiterate my point once again, just because I have some criticisms regarding the trailer of Spider-Man Far From Home, I still am cautiously optimistic of the film in general and really intrigued to see where it is actually going to go. But with all that said, let's move on to the first criticism that I do have with the trailer, is the characterization of Aunt May within the MCU. So after Marissa Tomei's introduction of Aunt May within Civil War in 2016, we do get our full-on portrayal of her within Spider-Man Homecoming in 2017, fully interacting with Peter in a really great way. She's a much more youthful interpretation of the character from how she is in the comics, as well as being more upbeat and more fun-loving towards Peter to really make him feel at ease whenever he's feeling down. As for one of the biggest character traits for Aunt May that can be found across almost every interpretation of her character is her overall love for Peter and her will to make sure that he is safe. Now within the previous Spider-Man films, it was always implied that Aunt May knew that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Now even though Aunt May never flat out confirms or denies that Peter is indeed our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man within the Sam Raimi films as well as the Mark Webb films, it's always implied that she is supportive of his heroic deeds. And all while Aunt May appreciates Peter being a savior for everyone in need, she would much rather prefer knowing that he is indeed safe, not putting himself in harm's way every single day when he does go out and be Spider-Man. Which is why the first scene of the international trailer of Far From Home leaves me a bit confused as to why Aunt May would actually leave Peter his Spider-Man suit to pack for his vacation. As we see later on in the trailer, Peter is hesitant to bring his Spider-Man costume along to his field trip to Europe to hang out with his friends, which we will talk about later on in the video. But given the full extent of knowledge that we have so far relating to Peter and Aunt May's relationship in the MCU, she does discover that Peter is Spider-Man by the end of Homecoming, and Peter is snapped out of existence by the end of Infinity War. And given whatever happens within Avengers Endgame, Peter somehow comes back from the dead and is continuing to be our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So who knows, maybe we will get some emotional closure between Peter and Aunt May once he does come back from the dead, or maybe Aunt May doesn't even know at all that Peter was in danger in the first place. However, given what we saw with Aunt May in Spider-Man Homecoming, I do find the characterization shift a bit odd, where she went from this,
if you spot something like that happening, you turn and you run the other way.
Yeah.
to this.
Thank you, Spider-Man!
That was so good.
And this leads into the biggest issue that I have with the trailer overall is Peter actually deciding to leave his Spider-Man suit behind while he goes on his trip to Europe. Now, to make this perfectly clear, I do understand that this is a trailer for a full-length movie that we have not seen yet. And usually with Marvel and Sony's trailers relating to Spider-Man, they always switch the audio clips around so that way they don't reveal too many spoilers for the film. And who knows, maybe this entire scene could be taken out of the entire movie by the time Far From Home actually releases in July, seeing how they did do similar stuff within Spider-Man Homecoming's trailer. But since Sony and Marvel did decide to include this portion of the movie within their initial trailer for Far From Home, I do think this is a big misstep on their part. Now, as we all know, Peter from the comics, and mainly within this iteration of the character in the MCU, has gone through a lot of grief in his life, dealing with the death of his Uncle Ben, as well as the events of Avengers Infinity War. And since Peter within Far From Home will apparently be experiencing PTSD given the events of Avengers Infinity War and possibly what happens in Avengers Endgame, there is obviously a lot of trauma going on for this iteration of Peter. So if Peter wanted to take a break from his spider heroics given those reasons I just listed, it would definitely make sense in that regard. But given what the trailer showed, I do think the reasoning for him taking a break is incredibly wrong and unjustifiable for the character in general. Given this portion of the Far From Home trailer, I do think it is fair to compare and contrast what the previous Spidey films' motivations were for Peter quote-unquote quitting being Spider-Man in those movie stories. While we do see him try and juggle both of his lives within Spider-Man 2 as the main theme of that movie, he ends up throwing his costume in the garbage at the middle point of the film given his lack of attention to his Peter Parker side. Due to his lack of attention and care to his normal life, Peter becomes more distant with Harry and MJ, as well as running late for his college courses and even failing at being a photographer at the Daily Bugle. Not to mention that the biggest reason as to why Peter ends up quote-unquote quitting being Spider-Man in Spider-Man 2 is because the lack of faith in himself to be a hero, as well as yearning to have a life of his own, hence why he starts to lose his spider powers and feels all the pressure put on him to be the hero that New York needs, and thus forth quitting being Spider-Man.
Maybe you're not supposed to be Spider-Man climbing those walls. That's why you keep falling. You always have a choice, Peter.
I have a choice. I can't live your dreams anymore. I want a life of my own.
You've been given a gift, Peter. With great power comes great responsibility.
This is easily one of the reasons as to why Spider-Man 2 is still regarded to be the greatest Spider-Man film ever made, and one of the most inspirational parts of the movie as well, when Peter decides to come back and be Spider-Man in order to save Mary Jane and the ones he cares for. So even though Peter decided to stop helping people as Spider-Man, he still tried to help himself and others as best he could as simply Peter Parker, and even during that burning building scene of the movie as well, where he had zero powers. And to take this even further, we also have The Amazing Spider-Man 2, where Peter decides to quit being Spider-Man after the death of Gwen Stacy. Given the massive guilt that Peter felt after Uncle Ben's death, he felt even more of a failure after Gwen Stacy died by the hands of the Green Goblin. This isn't just for the comic book storyline, but also for The Amazing Spider-Man 2's final act as well. After the events of The Amazing Spider-Man 1 took place, Peter continuously struggles in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 to decide whether or not he should be with Gwen Stacy given Captain Stacy's dying words.
So I want you to promise me something, okay? Leave Gwen out of it. Promise me that.
Even though Peter loves Gwen with all his heart, Peter decides to listen to Captain Stacy's final wish and distance himself from Gwen in order to protect her. And while they manage to remain on a friendship basis during the main portion of the film, they mainly confess their love to each other during the final act of the movie. And even though Gwen was planning to travel abroad for her own career, Peter was more than willing to follow wherever she would go because of how much he loved her. Which is why Gwen's death had such a big impact on Peter given where their relationship was going by the end of the film. So not only does Peter feel completely responsible for Gwen's death by the end of the movie, but he also feels like he completely let Captain Stacy down after his final dying wish. Although after some few heartwarming words from Aunt May, as well as re-watching Gwen's presentation speech at their high school graduation ceremony, Peter does remember that the city does need a hero and that Gwen would have wanted him to continue being the hero that he is. So even though Peter was gone for a few months as Spider-Man due to Gwen's death, he does come back afterwards, remembering that he can help others in need whenever he can. And And due to these justifiable reasons, it makes sense why both of these Peters would want to take a break from Spider-Man after the huge distress that they face on a daily basis. And this leads us to where we stand with Peter in the MCU and his overall representation of his character from the comics. The MCU's version of Peter is the youngest iteration of Spidey we've ever seen and the one to have his powers for the least amount of time. And given his connections with the other Avengers in the MCU, primarily Tony Stark, this allows him to learn under the wing of heroes that have more experience than him, which is a really interesting dynamic to see be played out on screen. But as we hear from Peter in Civil War and Infinity War, he is just a hero that is willing to do the right thing for those in need, primarily looking out for the little guy in trouble. And even though we do have a few references here and there to the MCU's iteration of Uncle Ben within Civil War and Homecoming, it still feels like Peter hasn't fully grasped the main lesson of with great power there must also come great responsibility. But like we have seen in the previous movies, Spidey is still adamant to saving everyone in trouble and trying to do his best to protect those in need. Which is why I personally find that one scene in the trailer to be completely out of place given how we went from this...
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
To this...
Don't pretend you thought this through. I know you didn't. You could not have possibly thought this through.
You can't be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man if there's no neighborhood.
To this...
I just want to go on my trip with my friends. Europe doesn't really need a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
What? What the fuck?
Now, as we move on ahead with the video, I will be bringing up potential spoilers relating to Avengers Endgame and Far From Home, so if there's any theory that I do have that may result in the potential ending of those movies, just keep that in mind. Now, if this scene in Far From Home is indeed a ruse from Sony and Marvel to hide the real fact as to why Peter is keeping his suit at home, I do believe it does result in the possible death of Tony Stark in Avengers Endgame. Even though we have absolutely no idea what will occur within Avengers Endgame, I do think one of the repercussions of that film is going to be the overall demise of Tony Stark within the MCU. Not only is this because Robert Downey Jr.'s contract to play Iron Man is almost up, but also it's not really looking too good for Tony within the first trailer for Endgame. So, if the reasoning were to be changed from Peter simply wanting to enjoy his vacation with his friends, even though Aunt May does end up packing his suit within his luggage regardless, to Peter actually experiencing incredible amounts of PTSD due to Tony Stark's death, that would be a great reason to show off in the movie and a great dynamic to play off of in the film's narrative. And moving on from the biggest criticism that I found with the Far From Home trailer is now leading into the smaller, more nitpick related items that I did find with the trailer overall. Mainly starting off with the chemistry or lack thereof between Happy Hogan and Aunt May, as well as Peter Parker and MJ. Now, I personally love Jon Favreau's interpretation of Happy Hogan within the MCU, and every time he pops up in any of the Marvel movies, it's always a laughable time. And given the supervisor role that Happy had within Spider-Man Homecoming, I do think that him and Peter had a really good connection with each other. But if Sony and Marvel are deciding to use Happy and May's connection with each other as a means of comedic relief in the film, I do think that time could be better used elsewhere to better develop the characters like Peter, Nick Fury, or maybe the antagonists of the movie. So even though there could be a possible deep connection between Happy and May, I do believe they will mainly use it to play out for laughs. And this leads into the other relationship I'm concerned to see play out on screen is between Peter and MJ. Now, in real life, Tom Holland and Zendaya are really close friends with one another, and it's really obvious to tell what great chemistry they have. However, every time Michelle appeared within Homecoming, she always brought this sense of negativity every time Peter was around with his sense of optimism and positivity. And while one of the highlights in Homecoming was the chemistry that Liz Allen and Peter had with each other, it wasn't implied at all that Peter and Michelle were getting along with one another until the very end of the film. So given that Michelle's character was extremely undeveloped within Homecoming, I really hope that Far From Home doesn't spend too much time on the Peter and MJ relationship, but rather just makes it as one of the small highlights of the film in general. This is mainly because they can spend more time on trying to highlight Peter's relationship with Nick Fury and the antagonist of the film with Mysterio and possibly his other connection to Aunt May. And even though Zendaya herself is a very enthusiastic and charismatic actress, I'm not really getting that same vibe from how MJ is portrayed in the MCU. So if the movie does decide to really focus on Peter and MJ's relationship, even though we didn't get any sense of that within Homecoming, I really hope that they do it justice. And this same point also goes for Happy Hogan and Aunt May if they do end up connecting on a much deeper level. And speaking of one of the other connections I previously mentioned is obviously the really interesting dynamic between Spider-Man and Nick Fury teaming up within Far From Home. As we saw in Infinity War, besides Spider-Man, Nick Fury was also decimated due to the Thanos snap, and he is somehow back after the events of Avengers Endgame within Far From Home. And while I am curious to see Nick Fury's role play out within this movie, I do think this might bring up some of the similar criticisms that people had with Homecoming. And that was mainly that Peter was too reliant on Iron Man throughout the majority of the film until the very end, where he does realize he can continue to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man without the Avengers' assistance, which is why he ends up turning down the Iron Spider suit by the end of the film from Tony. And even though Peter and Nick Fury have a really interesting working relationship with each other in the Ultimate Comics, I really hope that Far From Home doesn't follow the same exact pathway as what Homecoming did between Peter and Tony. Plus, it also seems like Nick Fury is simply being used as a plot device in order to move the story forward by providing Peter with the new suits that we see in the trailer, including the new Advanced Stark suit as well as the SHIELD stealth suit. So even though it will be very interesting to see Nick's role be played out within this movie, I really hope that Peter can be a bit more independent within Far From Home than what he was within Homecoming. And if there does end up being a scene where Peter flat out defies one of Nick Fury's orders, I do think that will be a very interesting dynamic that the movie can branch off of. So if a scene like that does indeed happen, this will not only give a really great character interaction between Peter and Nick Fury, given that Nick is a much more veteran SHIELD agent and Peter is a new and upcoming hero, but it will also give a really great character insight to how Peter views Nick in general. But speaking of character interactions, there isn't one more important than what we're going to see between Peter Parker as Spider-Man and Quentin Beck as Mysterio. Now, one of the main things that a lot of the Spider-Man villains in the previous films have in common is that they somehow all have some sort of deep connection between Peter Parker and themselves. For example, Norman Osborn as Green Goblin is not only Peter Parker's best friend's father, but also another type of father figure that Peter thought he could look up to in the first Spider-Man movie. As for Spider-Man 3, Peter literally ends up fighting Harry Osborn, his best friend, as the new Goblin, as well as his rival at the Daily Bugle, Eddie Brock, as Venom. And to top it all off, he also has to confront his Uncle Ben's killer, who does turn out to be Sandman in a twist in the film. And for the Amazing Spider-Man films, he does end up having to fight Dr. Curt Connors, who is another type of mentor slash father figure to Peter as the Lizard, as well as fighting Harry Osborn, who once again turns into another version of the Goblin. And mainly relating to Homecoming, Adrian Toomes is actually revealed to be the father of Liz Allen, which is Peter Parker's crush in that movie. And given what we know about Mysterio from the comics, it's going to be really interesting to see what type of connection Spidey and Mysterio have with each other in Far From Home. Sony and Marvel could possibly do another unexpected twist with Mysterio just like they did with Vulture in Homecoming, or they could do something completely different and totally revolutionize his character from what we know him in the comics. But regardless, given what we see in the Far From Home trailer, it's very obvious to see where the story is going with Mysterio's character in this film. The main villains of this movie are portrayed to be the Elementals to a lot of fans that may not know their characters, who do draw a lot of similarities to Molten Man, Sandman, and Hydro Man. And in a strange turn of events, we see Mysterio attempt to be a hero at the end of the trailer to try and take out Hydro Man all by himself. However, like all of us Mysterio fans know out there, Quentin Beck isn't necessarily a guy that can be trusted, and if he does, he's mainly in it for his own selfish interests. And given Mysterio's power set as well as all of his capabilities in the comics, it's very clear to see that Mysterio is obviously trying to portray himself as the hero of this story. Excluding whatever type of connection he will have to Peter in this film, Mysterio is going to be most likely conjuring all the Elementals to try and portray himself as a hero of the people and try and undermine Spider-Man while doing so. Sound familiar?
I invented weapons, and now I have a weapon that only I can defeat. And when I unleash it, I'll get... You sly dog! You got me monologuing! I can't believe it.
And while I have no problem of Mysterio showcasing himself as a hero to only be revealed as a villain within the third act, I do think this is a predictable story that we have seen before. And yes, I am very much aware that Mysterio was made decades before Syndrome was even a thing within the first Incredibles movie, but the sad thing is this story is extremely predictable to say the least. So hopefully Far From Home will be able to completely surpass all of my expectations that I have for the Elementals and Mysterio, and of course hopefully we can see them in some really cool action set pieces in the film in general. Especially considering that Quentin Beck from the comics is a master illusionist and a specialist in Hollywood special effects and a stuntman at that. And just knowing how good of a villain Vulture was within Homecoming, I really hope that they can do the same with Mysterio. Which brings us to the final point of this video is how. How can Marvel and Sony truly make Spider-Man Far From Home an incredibly great film and possibly the best Spider-Man film to date? And funny enough, the main factor as to how they can make this a truly great film is depending on how they portray Mysterio in general.
Yes, that's what my psychiatrist said.
Jake Gyllenhaal is perfectly great casting for Quentin Beck, and knowing the unpredictability of what Mysterio could do in this film either to Spider-Man or with the Elementals is a huge amount of surprise for the overall audience. Not to mention that the background of this universe's Quentin Beck could be completely different from how he is in the comics. And while there are people out there who do speculate he is actually using real magic, I still think they are going to stick with the basis of who Mysterio is, where he is just simply using illusions and stunt effects. This will not only cause massive illusions to appear throughout Europe, but it would also be a way to completely mess with the mind of Peter Parker himself. And even though this might be a bit similar to what Scarlet Witch does within Avengers Age of Ultron, making the entire team hallucinate crazy nightmares, I do hope the same thing can be done with Spider-Man in Far From Home due to Mysterio's powers. And knowing what Mysterio can do and has done in the comics, they could use this to a huge advantage to truly mess with the MCU's Peter's brain. This will not only be a great way to trigger Peter's PTSD even further, but it would also be a great way to expand Peter's depth as a character with more context through hallucinations. And what I mean by this is Peter could possibly start hallucinating either Uncle Ben's death within the MCU, or possibly vision something terrible happening to Aunt May. Or if we are to connect it to Peter's superheroics, we could envision himself dying again and again over on Titan within the ending of Infinity War, or depending whatever happens in Endgame, is visioning the death of Tony Stark in that film. And while it's unclear if the MCU is willing to go that dark of a route with Mysterio's powers, I really hope they can do something similar to that route to really show the serious stakes that Spidey has to face and the consequences that he has to overcome, thus rectifying some of the criticisms that people had with Homecoming and truly making Mysterio a standout villain. Which leads us to another unanswered question, is why Mysterio is doing the things he is in the movie. And while we don't know the full background of the MCU's version of Quentin Beck, I do think a really cool thing that could be done in the film is making him fully idolize Spider-Man. Not so much the amount of idolization that we felt from Max Dillon in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 or even Buddy from The Incredibles, but I do think that they could do something really interesting with Quentin Beck in Far From Home. The main reason why the Vulture despised the Avengers and mainly Iron Man in the MCU is due to them not taking responsibility for their actions in the previous films. And even though Adrian does threaten to kill Peter on the spot, he ends up not revealing his identity to the other criminals that are in prison with him. Plus, seeing how Peter was able to save Liz Allen and is actually a newer hero than the other Avengers, Adrian is a bit less threatening to him because he wants to see Peter actually try and prevail. And furthermore, Adrian flat out tells Peter that he's too young to understand how the world works. So even though the Vulture does end up being the main villain of Homecoming, he does try and see that Peter can be a better hero than what the Avengers were given his younger age, lack of experience, and therefore a new fresh start for the other heroes in the MCU. And how this all relates to Mysterio is that Quentin Beck could have possibly been a standard master illusionist and stuntman, but after seeing footage of Spider-Man, he then possibly could become inspired due to all of Spidey's heroics. Even though Spidey is the youngest hero in the MCU, Beck could see this as a fresh start for him to try and take inspiration from a new, fresher hero since all the Avengers might be gone at the end of Endgame. And even though this might be a bit too similar to the buddy/syndrome dynamic within The Incredibles, if done right, they could make Quentin Beck and Mysterio a really cool and thought-provoking villain. But still, we'll just have to wait and see until July to decide what type of villain Mysterio is actually going to be. But in the end, everyone, even though I did have quite a few criticisms with Spider-Man Far From Home's trailer, I still am cautiously optimistic towards the film in general and actually very intrigued to see where it is going to go in the MCU. With all of the great actors that are partaking within this movie, such as Tom Holland and Jake Gyllenhaal, as well as the incredible cinematography that the first trailer appears to have, there is a lot of expectations for Far From Home in general. And with Sony and Marvel holding the great power and great responsibility to deliver us a truly great Spider-Man movie, only time will tell to see how it ends up turning out. And with this giant discussion over, everyone, that is all my thoughts about Spider-Man Far From Home, and please let me know what all you think in the comments section down below. Are you personally excited for Far From Home? Did you agree with any of my concerns, or do you think that this movie could be a possible huge failure or a great success? Either or, this will pretty much be my only video discussing Far From Home until there is another trailer that I can react to or actually reviewing the movie when it does release. And until that time comes, true believers, thank you all so much for watching. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans. Peace out.
He's no Spider-Man.
What is it with you and Spider-Man?
What, he looks out for the neighborhood, has a dope suit, and I really respect him.
Flash, I need your car and your phone.
Sir, technically this is my dad's car, sir, so I can't...